A very good morning to you all. The 79th edition of the United Nations General Assembly has come to an end, and after nearly a month of conversations, speeches, debates and events, the curtains close on a world at war in many areas, with climate being a huge issue internationally. And looking at Africa specifically, questions continue to be raised over which countries will occupy a seat on the United Nations Security Council and whether Nigeria will be among them. All of these issues and more were discussed in a Rise exclusive interview with the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. Let's take a look. Deputy Secretary General, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it. Let's jump straight into it. Now that the Pact of the Future has been gavelled, can you talk to us about what we can expect, and then specifically what the United Nations is doing in terms of implementation, especially since it's such a trying time for the world?
Absolutely. Well, take the P off the Pact and we're ready to act. Right? That's the first thing. And when you look at the Pact itself, it starts off with really reaffirming that we have to finish the SDGs. That's the first chapter one. And that's important for us on all aspects of trying to get the social agenda done, the economy inclusive, and make sure we have the funding for that. Then we have three parts. There's a lot more to the Pact, but three big issues on peace and security. Making sure that that part of it is the UN repositioned to try to be more inclusive and representative of its member states, especially on issues of peace and security. That way bringing the solutions of everyone being at the table that is affected or who is going to bring support to peace processes. Then we have the new era of technology, and that really was about AI, putting guardrails around that to ensure that really the potentials of AI for the developing world are met and that we're not left behind and that there's a digital divide. Last but not least has been the financing agenda. It's been the bane of what has made it almost impossible for us to reach the SDGs on time. But we know that this is about the international financial architecture. So again, better representation in quotas, really looking to see how we can open up systems that are risk averse to the long-term concessional funding that is needed for development. And make that so in existing institutions, the Bretton Woods, the World Bank, the IMF, but also within the financial markets, and really tackle those that set, the metrics for risk.
Definitely. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Sustainable Development Goals. We do know that they form the cornerstone of your mandate as Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. If we were to focus specifically on SDG 13, which looks at climate action, and then put that against Nigeria as the example, when we are seeing extreme heat in the country, rising water levels, the flooding in Maiduguri, again, that has just happened recently, what can we expect from the United Nations in terms of advice or support in order to help the country achieve that specific SDG?
Well, one thing for sure, the climate agenda is an integral part of what the economy should be addressing. So in its transitions on energy, for instance, from fossil fuel to green, that's going to be important for industrialization. It's going to be important to get to those that are furthest behind. So you look at power on grid, off grid. But more importantly, I think, in Nigeria, what they've done is structure the platforms. I mean, through the Ministry of Environment and the special councils that the President has put in place, you've now got an interlocutor. And with the UN, one of the first things that we will be doing is looking at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that we all have to bring to Brazil in COP30 next year, that they're economy-wide. Plans that deal with adaptation, just as you've said. Extreme heat, floods, how are we going to deal with that, and what are the early warning systems, the emergency responses that we can have, and that we're not caught unawares all the time. And that has to be built into the economy, how we look at agriculture, smart agriculture that is climate resistant to the crops. We have to look at them differently, how we irrigate them. At the same time, we're going to be looking at many other issues of industrialization. When we look at the circular economy, that's all part of the climate agenda because it's less emissions. So for that, you have the UN, and you have the UN in its multiplicity of expertise. UNDP anchors the climate agenda for us, but there is UNEP on the environment program, there's WMO that works with our meteorological organizations for early warning systems. It will be complex because it won't be about one particular sector. There'll be a sector that leads, but or else it will matter. It's going to be important that everyone's involved. communities that feel this first, young people who will have the vision and the energy to drive this, parliamentarians that have to make the appropriations and have to make the regulations, and the system that has to look at how they will develop a response with technology, to education, to health, all of those in very extreme environments. How do you get education to people who are out of reach? Maybe one other issue I would say it's going to come up is that cities are going to be looked at differently. If they're coastal, sea levels would rise. If they're delta, sea levels will rise.
Right.
How are we going to deal with those cities and what that will mean from eternal displacement? That needs better planning. Urban planning will become a big thing of the future. Internally, I guess up in the north or Abuja, for instance, how you will grow the cities greener rather than the slums that will come if you don't plan. And these are some of the things that I think countries are going to have to contend with.
Indeed. Let's take a side step now and look at finance. You mentioned just then an overhauling all the international financial architecture. And we do know that earlier this week when Nigerian Vice President Kashim Shettima took to the stage, it's something that he also talks about a need for an overhauling of the international financial structure. And then he also went on to discuss debt burdens and how many countries in the developing world are struggling with stresses associated with their debt profiles. Again, with the United Nations, what type of influence can you have, or what do you think should be the case as it pertains to these developing countries, the quote-unquote global south, them trying to be a lot more internationally competitive and move away from this debt issue?
Well, first things first, we do have to deal with debt. A lot of this debt was not what was expected in terms of the servicing of it, and that's come as a result of an inability for us to recover better from COVID. Then we had further challenges with the war in Ukraine that put terrible stresses and strains on many countries for food security, for energy security. But as inflation went up in those countries, so then did interest rates for what we're doing. Today in Africa, we're paying more in debt servicing than we are receiving ODA. At the same time, many of our countries are having to choose between debt servicing and paying for education and health. This is just completely unacceptable. And we have to have mechanisms that will restructure this debt so that we can free up fiscal space, and then we're able to spend on the things that we're supposed to spend on. How's the UN addressing this? Well, we're working with the Bretton Woods institutions. The IMF had set up a scheme where we have what we call the Resilience Trust Fund, using SDRs to put into that so that countries can access them. They do have to be on an IMF program, but then that helps create some fiscal space for them to do stuff that they need to do. In the case of others, if you move aside from debt, because with an enormous amount of debt, your risk profile is not so good, right? And so what we have to do is get our credit rating agencies in the world to look at this differently and to see that long-term concessional funding is the way to go and not to be risk averse to that. They didn't do it when people were borrowing to recover from World War II.
Right.
You have debt that's there over 30 years. People, just paying some of it back now. So we've got to get into that mind frame, send those signals, and really look at that again. We have to reduce the cost of capital. Some of our countries have got good macroeconomic fundamentals, and yet when you look in Europe at how much people are accessing credit at 3-4%, Nigeria 16%.
Right.
I mean, this is not good. Having said that, we also have to create an enabling environment. We have to be prepared so that when investors do come in, that they're able to access all that is needed to set up a business and of course to prosper. The bottom line is that this is about profit. What we want is profit not off the back of people but of a good prosperous economy that includes people for jobs. And so we have to create that environment. In the case of many of our African countries, they're working hard at that. But it's not easy when you're constrained by a lot of this debt. You'll see in the Pact of the Future that we address that, and we got that action point on debt. That's very important. I think we will have some success. The G20's not been so good at responding to it as effectively as it could, but with the Brazilian leadership and what we have in the Pact, I think this is going to be taken much more seriously as we go into more negotiations in the financing for development next year that will be held in Spain. We've just given more leverage, more muscle at the table. And remember now the G20 has the African Union as a member. African countries as a bloc can take that in and can continue to push for a better treatment of debt.
Indeed. I want to talk to you very quickly about international conflict and international crises that we are seeing here. In fact, when we look at the statistics, international conflicts are hampering different countries from being able to implement their own SDGs. Mm-hmm. So if we see what we're seeing from Ukraine to Darfur to the Middle East, there's a lot of conflict going on simultaneously. And clearly it is having an impact on citizens. But I would like to talk to you about how it's affecting women and girls, mm-hmm. and what can be done to keep those subsections of society safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, conflict today, as I've said often, it's unacceptable in this day and age that we should be spending more money on conflict and wars instead of investing it in prevention and in people's lives and inclusion. In conflicts, those that suffer most are women and children. They bear the burden. Men will come back from a war and they'll be heroes. Women will come back and be discarded because of the level of gender-based violence that is meted upon them. You look at the children today and you see how many are coming back. But they've suffered so much. They come back with huge disabilities, both mental and physical. So the recovery from conflict is a lifelong debt. And that we need to learn how to avoid. I think if we put more into the prevention, particularly using some of the instruments we have on women, peace and security, on youth, peace and security, these are resolutions of the Security Council. We should implement them. That women, should you be completely off limits when it comes to conflict in terms of harm and gender-based violence. And that we put in the mechanisms there that when we do talk about peace, that women and young people are part of those processes. And they're at the table, they're in the mediation, they're in the healing and the bridging of communities, of nations. And that I think we have to give a big push to. Again, you'll see it in the Pact as really underscoring the importance of some of these processes. And then I think that after the crisis, and we always work towards that, we've got to get ready to catch those populations, host communities that have taken them in, internal displacement. Right. That's usually a multi-year response, and there's not often resources for that. So putting back in governance systems and making sure that when women are reintegrated into society, that they're given the care for services, for livelihoods, and of course what we now know is a huge issue in the world, the mental health issues.
When we look at Nigeria specifically, do you think that the quality of development and democracy in the country will play any type of role in the prospective admittance or the allowance for an African country, or Nigeria specifically, to have a permanent seat at the table on the UN Security Council?
Well, I think you would have seen that many member states have recognized that those that need to be in the Security Council, at least 2 seats should go to Africa. This has been said over and over again, and there's no reason why Nigeria should not be considered. But that's a member state decision. And within the African Union, there are many processes there that will come to the conclusion of what that is. But the Security Council has also talked about Asia. It's also talked about Europe. And I think what is more important is to have a Security Council that is representative today of the challenges that we have to address and bring conclusion to them.
Finally, I always like to ask about legacy.
Yes.
I know that there's still so much work for you to do, so much work that needs to be done, but you have achieved a whole of a lot. So when you look ahead to your legacy, what would you like it to be?
Don't talk about legacies. I just want to make sure I leave this place better than I met it. I think that's already happened. So if I was to leave today, I would be able to say that under the watch of the Secretary General, we have been able to ensure that in executive positions in the UN, we are 50-50, 50% women, 50% men. It was not like that when I came. Of the resident coordinators that manage the leadership of the UN footprint in over 130 countries is also half women and half men. There are younger people in these positions now in the UN. We have for the first time a youth office. We have put in special envoys and offices that deal with sexual exploitation and abuse, that there is a disability strategy. I think these are all things that I would say are success so far. Still got a couple of years to go. And what I would like to see is, many more. Today, I would say the UN is different in its representation of different walks of life. From all parts of the world, you will see we are not the same as when I came in. There are people, many more people and women from Africa, from Asia, from countries that never even got a chance to be represented. And so I hope that we can say we really are the world.
Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, thank you very much for your time.
Welcome.